obviously you got a
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another amazing episode on the Unleashing Potentials podcast. My name is Bernadette Desir, and I'm your host. And joining me today is Jim Bernardo, all the way from sunny hot Mexico, correct?
correct. Not
And
so
yeah, we were talking about the temperature difference. Can you tell us what's the temperature where you are?
Fahrenheit right now it's 71, which is give or take 20 degrees C.
Oh, that's
Um,
nice.
but it's chilly. Everything down here, all the construction down here is concrete block,
Mhm.
which is it holds heat in summer and it definitely gets cold in the wintertime.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's actually colder inside my house than it is outside.
Oh, wow. Here it's really cold. So I don't know how to convert it to Fahrenheit, but it's minus 24. It gets up to 30 something with the wind chill. So really cold. Frostbite within minutes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad I'm not where you are.
Yeah, yeah. Welcome to the podcast. Happy New Year. You
Happy
are
New
my first guest on the podcast for the new year.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah. So Jim, what is your story? And just tell us more about you, who you are, and what you do.
Sure. It's a complex, convoluted story, I guess. I'm semi-retired. I spent my working career in the technology industry, mostly in the software industry. But about 10 years ago, Bernadette, I got introduced to some men who were part of an organization called the Mankind Project. And the Mankind Project is an international organization focused on um, helping men develop emotional maturity. Um, more of the sacred masculine rather than what we hear so much about the toxic masculine. Um, I tend to dislike the word transformational because I think it gets overused to the point of meaninglessness. But the foundational event in Mankind Project is a weekend experience that is structured around Carl Jung's archetypes of the king, the lover, the warrior, the magician, and Joseph Campbell's cultural mythology of the hero's journey. So a separation from community, a descent, an ordeal, an initiation, a return. And on my weekend, I walked away from my weekend feeling like I had been sleepwalking through the first 55 years of my life. It was that, forgive me, transformational for
Mhm.
me. And so I got very actively involved with the Mankind Project. I would go back and staff weekends for other men, for other new men. And the Mankind Project sponsors men's groups that meet all over the world. And we would train men that if they're facilitating another man through a piece of work in group, to be very careful to not traumatize or re traumatize the man because we're not trauma experts. And so at some point after having gone through my own weekend, I chose to sit through a trauma recovery coaching certification program. And I wanted my focus to be on men because I am one, right? I'm not a woman. And as much as I can understand, I don't come from a woman's perspective, right? Um, in going through that program, as you can well imagine, I had the opportunity to uncover and handle some of my own childhood trauma. And I learned a great many things about us men that I didn't necessarily realize. And so at some point, well, so I'm devoting much of my retirement, first of all, to some one-on-one coaching of men, but more broadly to sharing these messages and providing support to men in groups, in seminars, webinars, weekend experiences, what have you. And I remember sitting down talking with a friend of mine about what I was thinking about doing. And I said, after I get some of this other stuff under my belt, I'm going to write a book. And she looked at me, she had a smile on her face, and she said, "No, you need to write the book now." And so I did. And the book it's on Amazon. It's called Echoes of Broken Skies. And in doing the research for the book, one of the first things that I uncovered was a statistic from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that came from the year 2020. In the United States, men are 49% of the population, yet they're 80% of successful suicides. And that kind of set me back on my heels a little bit. I started looking into suicide statistics among men around the world. And what I found was that that statistic is pretty consistent. So no matter where you're looking in the world, 3/4 or more of men three-quarters or more of successful suicides are by men. And the numbers translate to roughly one man every minute of every day, someplace in the world, successfully ends his life. So I got really, really interested in, why that's so. And, what I learned is that a lot of the experiences that we men have as boys are small t traumas. There's a therapist and author out of New England by the name of Terry Real who wrote the first ever book on male depression in the early 1990s. And that book was called, which I love the title, I Don't Want to Talk About It. And he leans heavily into a lot of the research that's out there. And he talks about things like there were some researchers who got together some newborn babies, 24 hours old. And they chose these babies to be of similar size and build and so on. And then they brought a bunch of adults through to look at these babies, 24 hours old, not 6 months, not 2 years, barely born. And they told half of the adults that these babies were all girls, and they told the other half that these babies were all boys. The adults who believed they were looking at girls said things like they were more fragile, more delicately built, et cetera, et cetera. The ones who thought they were looking at boys described them as being stronger, bigger boned, all those kinds of things. So they had nothing to go on in making those judgments other than they had been told they were boys or they were girls. There was another piece of research that was done where they taped I can't remember if it was a 6-month or 9-month-old baby playing with some toys, and a buzzer goes off, and the baby begins to cry. Same kind of thing. They told half the adults that the baby was a girl. They told the other half the baby was a boy. Well, the ones who thought they were looking at a girl said things like, "Oh, poor thing, she's so upset. Somebody needs to pick her up and hold her." And the ones who thought they were looking at a boy said things like, "Boys don't cry. He needs to toughen up." Right? So Terry's point in sharing those things is that we treat boys differently from how we treat girls from birth. And he goes further to say that, we presume femininity in girls, but we confer masculinity in boys. So, and, because we confer it, we can withdraw it. So Jim's the guy's guy. Everybody wants to be like him in school until that day in physical education class when everybody has to shimmy up a rope and Jim can't do it. And then he's a weakling, he's a pussy, he's, all these pejorative things that we would say. So we withdraw this idea that Jim's a guy's guy. Right? And he further makes the point that though we don't think of, and I've seen this in my practice, right? Though we don't think of those kinds of things in childhood necessarily as traumatic, sort of little t traumas, he said, in fact, they are. And, he said to recognize that those kind of repetitive injuries, if you will, in childhood are traumatic is kind of like expecting a fish to be able to see the water that it swims in, right? Mm-hmm. And I find this in my practice. A lot of the men that I work with, almost all the men that I work with in the very beginning when I first start talking to them, they will either say that no, 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 I didn't have a traumatic childhood. Or they say, yeah, I had stuff happen, but it wasn't trauma. And in fact, it was. In fact, it was. And those things tend to have long-term psychological and physical impacts well into adulthood. A lot of a lot of things like digestive tract issues, coronary artery disease, um, diabetes,
Hmm.
especially type 2 diabetes. Though this isn't true 100% of the time, a lot of those things are a direct result of unresolved childhood trauma.
Hmm.
And so, 4 times as many men as women successfully commit suicide. And the other interesting thing about that statistic is that more women attempt suicide, like an order of magnitude, more women attempt suicide than men. And yet, 4 times as many men as women actually succeed.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I mean that's kind of it in the short version of the story. But I am spending my life and time working with men to recognize those things that are unresolved from their childhoods that cause them real problems as adults. And, that is in part based on my research, but it is in large part based on my own experiences as well.
Hmm. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you. There's
Yeah.
so much to unpack. We're gonna slowly dive into different sections of what you've talked about because
Sure.
I believe it is so important for the work that you're doing to continue, not only where you are or where you've been in the States, but around the world. I'm in Canada, and I believe that your story will inspire not only men, but women as well.
Yeah.
And you're right, it does start in our childhood. And speaking of childhood, I want to hear more of your traumas, your stories, and how you have overcome them. I can see the empowering, amazing work that you're doing. Tell us more of what got you into doing what you're doing to help men.
Yeah. I told the story about getting involved in the Mankind Project. I kind
Hmm.
of guess you could say I kind of backed into it, right? There wasn't some point where I went, oh gosh, I got a bunch of unresolved wounds from my childhood that I need to heal. That stuff turned up as I started doing, my personal development. Um, a little bit about my background. So I'm of Italian extraction, right? My father was born in Italy. It's a very long family story that I don't need to spend a lot of time on, but basically, he was raised by his grandfather because my grandfather had come to the United States to, as so many immigrants did then, to sort of get established, make money, eventually bring the family. And, long story is that my grandfather was actually born in the US in 1899, but his mother died during a subsequent childbirth. And so his father, my great grandfather, took him back to Italy. And they were from a small town in southern Italy, which, at least at that time, there weren't such things as birth certificates from, the local government. So the only records of birth were baptismal certificates through the church. So my great grandfather never told my grandfather or his siblings that they had been born in the US. And so my grandfather came to the US to, as I described. And when World War II broke out, my grandfather discovered that he was an American citizen by birth because he was drafted into the US Army. And because the US and Italy were at war, other than an occasional letter through the Red Cross, my father, my grandmother, my aunt didn't know whether he was alive or dead or where he was. And toward the end of the war, um, or after the end of the war, my grandfather wrote to my grandmother and my father and my aunt and said he wanted them to come to the U.S. and join him. Well, meanwhile, my father had grown up, and my grandmother at one point had sent him to an all boys school run by the Jesuits in Amalfi. And so my father, was reasonably well educated for a young man, whereas my grandfather was not. So in December of 1947, my father and my grandfather My mother got on a boat and came to the US, and my father met his father for the first time at the age of 16 and a half. Now, at that age, you're pretty well formed as a young man. And because my father had been raised by his grandfather was his role model for what a man should be. And I never knew my great grandfather, but through family lore, he was a very typical Southern Italian tyrannical patriarch. Whereas my grandfather was a very laid back, mild mannered, sweet kind of guy. My dad saw that as weakness. And so he stepped into what he perceived as a void, and he became the family patriarch in the same mold as his grandfather, which was you do as I say, you never question what I ask you. And so he was that kind of very strict disciplinarian and was also prone to outbursts of anger, often out of proportion. I mean, it's easy to look back now, out of proportion to whatever it was that angered him in the first place. And tying this back to trauma, one of the things that we understand about trauma victims is that when a traumatic thing happens, and I'm not talking about a plane flies into the World Trade Center. I'm talking about these little T trauma things that happen in childhood. The right side of the brain, and they looked at this in functional MRI machines, right? The right side of the brain lights up like fireworks. And the right side of the brain is where the limbic system is, the amygdala, the whole origin of the fight or flight, fawn or freeze response, which is evolutionarily ancient, but not designed for personal development, if you will, right? It's that part of the brain that springs into action when you're in danger of getting ripped apart by a saber-toothed tiger on the Serengeti, right?
Yeah.
It's, again, it's evolutionary, very ancient.
Mhm.
And when that happens, it's an automatic physiological response, which you most likely have no awareness of and definitely cannot control, right? Because the amygdala begins to pump stress hormones into your blood system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The really interesting thing that the researchers found out when they were looking at this is that the left side of the brain virtually shuts down. And among the things on the left side of the brain is an area called Broca's area, which is involved in the production of speech. So what they found is when they were able to trigger flashbacks in their study subjects, and they were looking at the brain, was that whole area shut off. Therefore, they discovered that survivors of childhood trauma can often describe traumatic events that happened in their lives as though they were looking at a photograph, but they cannot tell you how they felt because that part that would have allowed them to give speech to the experience was off. So I use a personal example in the book of Mother's Day 1970. I was about a month short of my 10th birthday. And my dad and I were washing our car in the back of the house. And, it was morning. I remember where the sun was. I remember which side of the car I was on, which side he was on. And something triggered his anger. And one of the things he said to me was, remember this day, Mother's Day 1970. Now, I'm 64 years old. I was just short of my 10th birthday. So 54, almost 55 years later, I can remember that morning as though I'm looking at a picture of it. But I can't tell you how I felt. I mean, generally, I'm sure I was upset, whatever, but I cannot tell you how I was feeling at that point in time because the speech production part of my brain was off. So language has a lot to do with trauma recovery. And what scientists understand now is that those experiences and the language that we can or cannot give to them actually wire circuits in the brain. And this is not like a philosophical or woo-woo discussion. They literally physiologically wire circuits in the brain. And so trauma recovery is about rewiring those circuits. And how do we rewire those circuits? We do it by giving different language to the experience. So, this is all stuff that I learned in my late 50s, 60, 61 years old as I was going through that trauma recovery course. And God, it's incredibly true for me.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of my healing has been totally about being able to sort of, as I feel those kinds of triggers coming on, as I feel those flashbacks of traumatic events coming on, to be able to take a step back, take a breath, and pay attention to what's going on in my body, right? And this again is a place where language is really important. So, I'm feeling butterflies in my stomach. I feel some tension across my shoulders. What is that? Well, that's fear. Or, I feel this tightness in my chest and my jaw is clenched. What is that? Oh, that's anger. I'm angry about something. So, I coach my clients on practicing that sort of body awareness just in the course of your day, right? My head feels open and bright, and I have a smile on my face, and my chest is open, and oh, I'm happy. Or, so practicing understanding and being aware of those bodily sensations so that when a trigger begins to happen, it becomes more practice, almost second nature to be able to do that. And I can recognize I'm not about to get my butt torn off by a saber-toothed tiger. I'm not in, right?
Yeah.
And so I can choose now to respond to whatever's going on in the moment as a mature adult, as opposed to reacting to it in this sort of automatic, triggered amygdala response kind of a way. Does that
Mm-hmm.
help?
Oh yeah, it does plenty. Yeah. And yeah, women and men definitely experience traumas differently. And I've always strived to understand how men thinks. And I love that you also talk about small t trauma. I have a book that I'm looking at, and I keep looking at it and putting it away, looking at it, put it away, because there are some type of small t traumas. I just don't understand what's wrong, but something feels wrong. I can't pinpoint what it is to do the work on it. Would you say, based on what you've shared about small t trauma, is that something that you've experienced or seen in your clients?
Oh, gosh, yes, absolutely, all the time. And as I said, Bernadette, most of these men don't realize it when we first start working together, right? Um, you know, we tell boys growing up that it's not okay to feel vulnerable, that it's not okay to show weakness, that it's not okay to cry, that there are emotions that we sort of identify as, forgive me, masculine emotions. Anger is a masculine emotion, right? So what we see that happens a lot is that, and this is a big difference between men and women, right? Because women are taught from the time that they're girls that it's okay to feel the need for some emotional support. It's okay to cry. It's okay, women are far more likely when they're dealing with something like that to recognize that they're feeling sadness or they're feeling depressed and seek help for that. Whereas men are far more likely to go to their doctor and say, "Hey, doc, I don't know what's wrong with me. My heart sometimes beats out of control. I have trouble grabbing my breath." They report physical symptoms, which are actually psychological symptoms, but they don't recognize it. And often their doctors don't either. So, the doctor checks you out, does an EKG, whatever. Jim, you're okay. Maybe you've got a little bit too much stress going on in your life. Try and take some time to relax. That doesn't really help, right? And so the men, until they begin to uncover, and by the way, we feel all of those things. I feel sadness. I feel the need for emotional support. I feel weakness sometimes. I feel, but repressing or denying those things because I've been taught they're not okay for men to show leads to all sorts of psychological and physical health problems in the longer term.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about the book called The Body Keeps the Score.
Love that book.
Me too.
It was one of, it was, yes, that was one of our pieces of required reading in the trauma recovery program.
Yeah. So what was your experience after reading it, even while you were reading it?
Well, excuse me. So another piece about my background that I didn't tell you is that I have a graduate degree in behavioral psychology, right? And so I tended to think of everything in behavioral terms rather than, you know, and I was, I'll say this from my vantage point, I felt like I was more in the woo-woo part of the spectrum than I was in the practical science-based, understanding of these things. And in fairness, there's a lot that science understands about the brain and how it works now that 20 years ago it didn't, right? For forever, we believed that the brain was a very unchanging kind of an organism. And at least in part through research in trauma, and I'm not talking about little t trauma now. If I have a severe head injury that damages a part of my brain, another part of my brain over time will take over the function of that part that was damaged and no longer working, right? But they've also discovered now that circuits in the brain can be rewired based on experience as well. And this is the thing that's crucial in small t trauma, right? And understanding that it's not something that's permanently and unchangeably wired. It can be rewired. And language plays a pivotal role in that. So, I don't just describe or interpret my experience of things in the world with language. I create my experience. Right? So if you and I, for example, were sitting across the table from one another, let's just say there was a pitcher or a vase or something in the middle of the table, and I asked you to describe it, you might tell me what color it was, how the light was hitting it, however you would choose to describe it. And if I would then ask you, where is that vase? You would more than likely point to the thing on the table. And the truth of the matter is, the vase you just described is not there, it's here. And I might describe it very differently because the light's hitting it from a different perspective, whatever. But I create and you create the experience of that vase here with the language that you give to it. Right? The physical thing exists, yes. Your experience of it is here, right? Mm-hmm. So healing from childhood trauma is about creating a different experience. That day my father told me, remember Mother's Day 1970, probably I wasn't doing something as well as he expected me to do it. He was frustrated. He had, perhaps a limited toolkit as a parent based on his upbringing, his own childhood wounds. Okay, I can actually understand that, have some compassion for him, recognize that I wasn't, lazy or a bumbling idiot or, whatever he might have said to me at the time. That wasn't true for me. That was his reaction to whatever was going on at the time based on his wiring, his experience. Okay, recraft that experience in my head, have a lot of compassion for my dad, love him, he's passed, miss him, so it's an entirely different relationship than I had with him growing up.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I know there are different methods and therapies that every day there's new research and statistics on them of kind of putting someone under a different state to kind of have them recreate the situations that they've experienced. How successful do you think that is for men?
God, it's the only thing that is successful in the long run. Because again, I talk a little bit in the book about the power of language. I did my graduate work in behavioral psychology on language, by the way. It's sort of interesting from this age and this place to be able to look back on my life and see how kind of all roads led to here. The only and I'm going to draw a distinction here between kind of, traditional, excuse the dogs barking in the background, the kinds of traditional talk therapy that happen with psychotherapists more often than not. And I'm not invalidating those at all. And in dealing with uncovering and healing trauma, language is the only thing that works. It's the only thing that works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Okay?
yeah. Can you give me some examples of the type of language that you're talking about? Because I think there's so many different types of languages. Is it body language? Is it how men speak to themselves or how they interpret how people speak to them?
It's more the latter than the former. I mean, body language obviously plays a role in all of this, right? And particularly as I was talking about before, being able to be aware of and recognize what's happening in my body, not yours, in
Mm.
mine, right? When something triggering or frustrating happens, being able to tag that to a bodily sensation, because then I can work to calm that bodily sensation, which also calms my nervous system, lets my rational brain take control, and I can begin to describe things differently. I remember another incident from my childhood. I won't talk about this one in the book. I think I was 5, somewhere in there, and my father was building a new bathroom in the basement of our house, and I was dad's helper. So he was doing plumbing, and he told me to hand him an elbow, an elbow joint out of copper that was in a box sitting beside us. And I had no idea what it was.
I don't know what it is, so
It's just a plumbing fitting, right? That
Ah,
looks like an
okay.
elbow, okay? And
Yeah.
and I fumbled or I got the wrong thing out of the box or whatever, and my father started to excoriate me about, am I stupid, and give me an effing elbow, and whatever, whatever, whatever. At that time, I probably internalized that I must be dumb,
Mm.
right? Because that's what he was telling me. When he showed me an elbow, yeah, I could figure out that kind of looks like an elbow. Okay, why couldn't I figure that out before? I must be stupid, right?
Mm.
Being able now to look back on that and, you know, say a couple of things to myself. I was 5 years old. How the heck did I know what a plumbing fitting was going to look like? And yeah, it's obvious that, it looked like an elbow, so it's an elbow, but probably not to a 5-year-old. Okay,
Yeah.
A, well, I'm not stupid. B, wouldn't it have been nice if my dad had had the wherewithal or the presence and awareness to think, okay, he's 5 years old. He doesn't know an elbow is. Jim, take a look. This is an elbow. So next time I ask you for one, now you know what I'm asking you for, right? But he wasn't able to do that. He got triggered. And so he yelled at me. So, in being able to not just reevaluate, but recreate that experience in that way, that heals that you're stupid wound. And by the way, there were lots of your stupid wounds from my childhood. But that's an example of the kind of thing that I can um, resolve, heal, move forward from through giving different language to that experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I was
So
just talking about that yesterday, connecting it to my story, with different generations in my family, how they talk to each other, the trauma that they carry from generation to generation. And I always tell people it stops with me because it's a choice. It's a very difficult one to break, a very hard cycle to break, but it is doable with a lot of work. What are your thoughts on that?
yeah, absolutely. Generational trauma is a thing, right? I mean,
Mhm.
that's not just sort of a term of art; it's a thing. Um, I imagine that this is equally true for women as it is for men, but you grow up having a model of what it means to be a man or to be a woman. And, kind of obvious, but, for boys, that model is usually dad. For girls, that model may be mom, right? Well, those folks had their own set of wounds and unresolved issues from their childhoods. And, my dad, what is this, 2025? My dad would have been 94 if he had lived this long. And, at 94, certainly when he died at 88, he, hadn't been aware or ever done any work to try and resolve that. And, there's a cultural component as well, right? I come from an Italian background. Man, weekends were like all the family gathered around in the kitchen over a meal, yelling at each other and laughing with each other. I mean, just that kind of typical noisy thing. And things were said that, in retrospect, may not have been kind, but we just sort of took it as part of that's how this family works. And I remember talking with a friend of mine about this one day because he comes from a Latin American background, and we were sort of comparing notes about the big family gatherings and all that kind of stuff. And I said to him at one point, I said, the only person that could shut my dad up or call him on the carpet for something he was saying or doing was my grandmother, right? Because
Yeah.
he grew up under her and his grandfather, but under my grandmother because my grandfather wasn't there. And my father, it's not too much of an exaggeration to say he worshiped his mother, right? And I remember my friend smiling at me, and he said, I talked about these archetypes, the king, the lover, the warrior, the magician. And he said to me, he said, your grandmother was your model for sovereign, for king, because that's also kind of my style. It's very calm, very quiet. I mean, it wasn't always this way before I did my work, but she was my model for what an adult looks like, acts like. And the realization of that was pivotal because a lot of my behavior before I did this work was very much like my father. I would get frustrated about something or angry about something, and I would blow. And, inevitably, after I would have one, I'd have a full blown amygdala hijack. Can't do anything about it, not even
Yeah.
consciously aware that I'm reacting way out of proportion to whatever the heck it is that's going on. And when that would be over, I would feel immense remorse and I'd feel, forgive me, like shit.
Mm.
Here I go again. Why did I do that? Look at how I hurt the people around me. And, but by then the damage is done, right? So learning how to become more and more aware of those things and choosing to act differently is how you break that, you know, generational hand down of family trauma. And you're
Yeah.
right, it's hard. I mean, all of this stuff is hard and it's deceptively easy, right?
Mm. Yeah.
It's really easy for me to sit here and say, yeah, get into your body, see what's going on, take a couple of breaths, calm your nervous system, give different language to the experience. It's all pretty straightforward. And in the moment of having to do it, it can be challenging.
Mhm.
And, as I told my clients, the more you practice it, the better you get at it. And the more that you practice that kind of awareness just in the course of your day, right? I mean, we walk through our days mostly unconsciously, doing whatever comes next, whatever, is on my list of stuff to accomplish today, not really ever taking the time to pay attention to what's going on in my body right now. What does that mean about how I'm feeling? What is there
Mhm.
that I can do? If I'm feeling unpleasantly, what is it that I need to address here, need to do to shift that? And that's very much about bodily awareness and understanding, excuse me,
Mhm.
understanding the feelings that I ascribe to those physiological sensations.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. So I'm not a man, obviously, to describe this how I want to describe it. I know in society there's pressure, expectations, and they normalize for men what is normal. when they should allow people to express themselves how they want to be expressed. I don't know what masculinity is like. And that's why I'm always open-minded to listen. But we do live in a culture that wants people to be a certain way, which restrict them from being who they are, from healing. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and you know this conundrum, I'll call it, is becoming more and more important, right? So, you know, the present political environment in the United States notwithstanding, there have been huge strides in the last 20, 30 years for women in coming into their own, you know, more equal rights. I mean, these are all things that should have been true all along. And, you know, it's become very much more in the forefront of the advancement of women's rights and women's equality and, you know, right? What has not happened at the same time is any effort to teach men what it means to be a man in a world where women are your equals. They're not subservient to you. You are not a patriarch expected to run everything. All of these, you know, quote unquote traditional ideas you've been taught about what the role of a man is, need to change. The stuff that's happening for women is awesome, and nobody's taking that away. I said present political climate in the U.S. put aside for a moment, because there is very much an effort in the U.S. among a certain group to push back the rights of women, you know, back to the 1950s, 1960s. And that's not going to be sustainable, but that's a whole other conversation for a different podcast. But what has happened is, while we have been celebrating these advancements for women, we've not been paying any attention to what that means for the men and how they need to change and begin to act and behave differently. And in fact, a lot of the same groups of people who are celebrating the progress made by women are looking at men and saying, stop whining, pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. What's the matter with you? Now, had we been saying that to women in the last 10, 20, 30 years, you know, we'd have gotten a good solid punch in the nose.
Yeah.
But that's how we're talking to the men. And so the only people that are really talking to the men, and particularly younger men, about what it means to be a man, are, you know, these far right talking heads like Jordan Peterson or Andrew Tate or Joe Rogan, who continue to promote the idea that things like the patriarchy are the natural order of things. Well, it's not. Yeah, patriarchy's been around for long, you know, thousands of years, and if you dig back into the historical and anthropological record, that was not a function of biology. It never was. And in fact, at, you know, certain points in the development of human beings, this kind of societal structure where the men are the providers, they're the ones that go out and hunt the bison and, you know, the woolly mammoths and do the gardening, and the women who have the unique ability to reproduce are the ones who are creating offspring, many of whom hopefully will be male, so that they can grow up to go slay the elephants and right. That kind of a structure served an evolutionary purpose at a certain point in human history, but it no longer does. And it certainly was not determined by biology at all, or by any sort of natural law. It was, you know, a social evolution that served a particular purpose at a particular point in time. And therefore, there's no written rule that says that because it is the natural order of things, that is how things need to continue, right? So, you know, those kinds of talking heads, far from helping younger men in particular understand how their behavior could, should, needs to change to adapt to a different world than their fathers, grandfathers, great grandfathers lived in. It doesn't serve men to keep trying to tell them that, and it doesn't serve women to keep telling men that. And so, something needs to shift. Um, I wish that I could flip a switch and heal all the men, but it doesn't work that way, right?
Yeah.
So I'm doing what I'm doing, one or two or 10 men at a time. And, hopefully for every 10 men that I work with, five of them will go off and start doing this with men in their lives. And it's like
Mhm.
the whole thing about the butterfly flapping its wings and across the world, there's a tornado.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes that's all it takes to impact a few. It's like a chain reaction.
Mhm.
And I believe in the work you're doing. It is doing that. And sometimes the progress may look very small, but the impact is massive.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
One of the taglines, I guess, for the Mankind Project used to be, I don't know if it still is, because I'm not super involved with Mankind anymore, but one of the taglines used to be changing the world one man at a time,
Mm.
right? And for every man that I can help, um, I'm indirectly helping their children, their partners, their friends, because I'm helping these men find a different, more emotionally mature, more satisfied, happier version of themselves. And as they carry that into their lives, that's going to have an impact on all of the people in their world.
Yeah, yeah. So Jim, what would you say sets you apart from other coaches? Because there are so many coaches. Some of them maybe do similar work that you do. What is your signature recipe that you share with the people that you work with?
Well, I think it's, again, I think it's a product of my background, Bernadette. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
between the love and learning about language, the trauma recovery work, the, all of those things together, I think, um, bring a unique understanding approach. And by the way, what I do is not based on having gotten a PhD in clinical psychology and, working out of a textbook. Very much of what I do is based out of my own experience, for one thing. Secondly, I tell men that I work with, in the very beginning, I am not a therapist, I'm a coach, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
difference that I see there is a therapist is got a base of knowledge and is going to sit down and listen to you and match it up against that base of knowledge and say, okay, you need to do this and you need to do that, right? As a coach, my job is more to help you discover a path for you because every man's path is going to be different, right? Show you what that path might look like, walk alongside you for a certain portion of time down that path. Oh, by the way, based on my knowledge and my experience, tell you the kinds of things that you might encounter on that path. And I
Mm-hmm.
can tell you, I will tell you where to look. I'm not going to tell you what you're going to see
Yeah.
because you're going to see what you're going to see. And your experience, even though we've got some commonalities in our experience as men, your experience is unique to you. Now, by the way, when you see a big hole in the road, we may talk about that. And I may share with you some stuff about how to avoid falling into the hole or, what happened when a hole like that showed up in my life, whatever, whatever, whatever. But I'm never going to tell you what you need to do or what you're going to see. I'm going to coach you, much like an athletic coach, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing. I
Yeah,
have, I think, three questions as we wrap up. The
sure.
first one is, how can people connect with you if they'd like to work with you?
Yeah. So people can email me is probably the best way to connect with me. I don't have a website up yet. That's one of the things I need to do. But the email is 1 degree shift, all written out, ONEDGRE shift at iCloud.com. Tell you just for a second the logic behind that. So there was a point in my life where I also flew airplanes, right? I was a private pilot. Stopped doing that a long time ago for a bunch of reasons. But one of the things that they teach you is what's called the 1 in 60 rule. So if a plane veers off course by 1 degree after 60 miles, it'll be a mile off course. And if it keeps going down that, after 120 miles, it'll be 2 miles off course, so on. Right? In aviation, that's a bad thing, but, right?
Yeah.
But in the work that I do, I think that's actually a really good thing, right? Because I may see that that's where I want to go. And
Mhm.
as I begin to do the work and learn more about me, begin to address trauma and so on, I might shift where I want to be a little bit. And I might shift a little bit more. And I might get a clearer vision of where it is that I want to end up. So yeah, 1 degree shift at iCloud.com. The
Mhm.
book, as I said, is on Amazon. It's called Echoes of Broken Skies. There's a bunch more information in there. Yeah.
Awesome. Is there anything that you want to share that we didn't get to discuss or talk about?
Oh God, Bernadette, you and I could probably a couple of days about this. No, I think that's the crux, right?
Mm,
The men are not okay. They're
mm,
really not. They've been taught never to show that they're not okay. So much so that mostly they don't realize they're not okay.
mhm,
And, the work that I'm doing is about helping them uncover that they may not be as okay as they think they are. And oh, by the way, that's all right.
mhm.
That's all right.
Yeah, yeah.
First step in solving a problem is recognizing that there is one, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to help men do, to
Mhm.
recognize the things that have crafted them into the unsatisfying, isolated, lonely place that they
Mhm.
are today.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing. My last question for you. I ask every guest, and my answer changes for myself every 2 seconds. What is the meaning of life for you?
Oh, sorry, I got to end this with another quick story. I actually have this in the book as well. There's a great book that a friend of mine recommended to me a long time ago called The Cafe at the Edge of the World.
Oh.
It's a novel, but it's a novel about the meaning of life. And the
Mhm.
you know basic story is this guy is headed off for a weekend of relaxation at night. Uh, encounters a lot of traffic, tries to take a detour, gets horribly lost. When he's almost out of gas and hasn't seen anything for hours, he comes across this little diner. And he goes into the diner and they hand him a menu and he's thumbing through the menu. And when he gets to the back cover of the menu, there are 3 questions. Why are you here? Do you fear death? And are you fulfilled?
Mm.
Right. And I actually have that printed out and taped up over the mirror in my bathroom. Um, you know, my purpose is this. It took me a long time to figure that out, right? But my purpose is doing the work that I'm doing. It's the thing that I can give back that can maybe have an impact and um, have a positive impact on some men and therefore the world. And, questions 1 and question 3 are very intricately linked for me. When I feel fulfilled, when I have that, this is what I should be doing, then I know I'm fulfilling my purpose.
Mhm.
So, the meaning of my life is to help men to the extent that I can heal from the kinds of wounds that I experienced, that they experienced as young boys. And if I can help men, even my generation, who have more years behind us than we do ahead, but especially if I can help younger men who are in their 20s or 30s and are aware of their unhappiness and loneliness and dissatisfaction. And this is happening, Bernadette, I think at a really interesting point in time because the COVID pandemic that began in 2020 contributed a great deal to isolation and loneliness because people had to stay home. Right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So I think it has helped surface some of these things a lot more easily for especially younger men than had that never happened. Right. So it's kind of a propitious time to be doing the kinds of things that I'm doing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, Jim, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your journey, and passion with us. You are a breath of fresh air, and I needed to hear what you had to share. because I'm not a man. I don't understand, and I may not understand, and that's okay. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Bernadette. I really enjoyed
You're
it.
welcome.